Dr. Amanda Fitzgerald is an Associate Professor in the School of Psychology. She completed her PhD in NUI Galway. Her research focuses on understanding risk and protective factors of young people's mental health. She's does lots of things apart from that in the school as well. She's a member of the school's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, an executive committee member of the International Association for Youth Mental Health, and a former board member of Spun Out. Thank you very much, Amanda. We look forward to hearing your talk.
I'm delighted to be here today to talk you through a piece of work that we've conducted on the My World survey. This research is conducted in conjunction with Dr. Ciara Mahan, who's postdoctoral researcher and was postdoctoral researcher on the My World survey, Professor Barbara Dooley, who's PI on the My World survey, and at the time Dr. Aileen O'Reilly, who was research manager in Jigsaw. And today really what I'm focusing on is looking at changing trends in adolescents' depression and anxiety using repeated cross-sectional surveys. So the My World Survey 1, which was conducted in 2012, and the My World Survey 2 conducted in 2019. And we're focusing here on adolescent mental health, and we know it's a critical period for development, which has significance for the likelihood, the shape and the course of the development of mental health problems. A recent large-scale meta-analysis indicated that about 62.5% of all serious mental health disorders occur before the age of 25 years of age. And we know there's a kind of perception about adolescent mental health being a crisis in terms of many young people not getting access for support when they need it, many mental health problems not being detected until later in life, and a growing body of evidence supporting the benefit of early intervention for young people's mental health. Numerous studies internationally in the US, New Zealand, the UK, many European countries have pointed to increases in symptoms of anxiety and depression in adolescents. However, the factors underpinning these trends remain poorly understood. There are a number of gaps in the research. Yes, studies have looked at time trends in symptoms of anxiety and depression over time, but less research has explored these potential predictors of changes in mental health outcomes. Of the studies that have looked at predictors of changes, they particularly looked at risk factors. So are increases in risk factors linked with increases in mental health? Very little research has looked to see whether decreases in protective factors or changes in protective factors may actually have an impact in these increases in mental health difficulties. When I'm talking about a risk factor here, I'm talking about a characteristic or circumstance that could increase the likelihood for mental health problems. And by a protective factor, I'm talking about a broad range of assets that can support a young person in terms of their mental health. So a risk factor here, we're talking about cannabis use, bullying, discrimination. A protective factor, we're talking about social support, optimism, resilience, and so on. And another gap with the research literature is that it hasn't examined the collective impact of individual, school, peers, family factors in relation to adolescent mental health outcomes. So the broad overarching aim of this research was to examine whether we see increases in self-reported symptoms of anxiety and depression from 2012 to 2019 using very closely matched samples from the second level data sets. So we have three research questions here. Are there increases in these symptoms of depression and anxiety between My World Survey 1 and My World Survey 2? Do we see increases or decreases in the risk and protective factors for mental health across the waves? And finally, do changes in risk protective factors, to what extent are they potentially predictors of change in anxiety and depression? So these are the research questions that we set out to answer. So we're using the second level data sets, which comprise a nationally representative sample of adolescents in post-primary schools in the Republic of Ireland. Both My World Survey 1 and My World Survey 2, our school sampling strategy represents the national distribution of schools in terms of disadvantaged, non-disadvantaged status, in terms of gender composition, in terms of the 9 HSE CHO regions. So in My World Survey 1 we had over 6,000 adolescents 12 to 19 years of age, and then in My World Survey 2 we had 10,000 participants. So I'm not going to go into depth on the range of measures that we looked at, but our main outcome measure was the DAS, looking at symptoms of depression and anxiety. And then some other negative domains would be psychotic-like symptoms, tapping into hallucinations, and spying, and alcohol use was looking at the audit, a standardised measure of alcohol risk. We combined the mother-father criticism into parental criticism. We looked at negative coping strategies, to what extent do they avoid their problems. And then brief one-item indicators about cannabis use, having been bullied, having been discriminated against, having body dissatisfaction. Tapping into the positive domains then, we used the widely known Rosenberg self-esteem measure, looking at global self-worth, parental approval, dispositional optimism through the lot. Resilience here, we're tapping into personal competence, and this is really looking at the extent to which you take a positive outlook on the problems you face. It's also tapping into this kind of personal hardiness and self-efficacy and goal orientation. We looked at peer and school connectedness, a multidimensional scale of perceived social support, then tapping into some of the positive coping strategies. Do you engage in problem-focused coping? Do you talk about your problems? And then formal help seeking, which is, have you had any serious problems? And if you feel you did, to what extent did you feel the need to actually seek professional help? So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the measures. In terms of the sample frame for My World Survey 1 and 2, they were broadly matched in terms of key characteristics, in terms of age, gender, school year. So 60% across wave 1 and 2 were in the junior cycle. Interestingly here, we do see ethnicity, a higher percentage of those who identify as white in wave 1, but the way we measure that demographic varies slightly. So in My World Survey 2, we put in the mixed background, so we have a higher percentage in that category. But broadly, the samples were matched in some of these key characteristics. So the task can be used to classify people into these different categories of depression and anxiety using these recommended cutoffs. And using chi-square tests layered by wave, what we see here is that adolescents in wave 2, so in 2019, were much more likely to fall into the moderate, severe, very severe categories for anxiety, and they were also more likely to fall into the moderate, severe and very severe category for depression. We also then ran interactions, gender by wave, school cycle by wave, on the mean scores for depression and anxiety. And here what we see is that regardless of wave, those in the senior cycle, those who identify as female, had significantly elevated levels of depression and anxiety. But we did see for females in the My World Survey 2 that their anxiety and depression was significantly elevated compared to the My World Survey 1. So to give a snapshot of this, for example, what we see here is that taking the sample as a whole, for those who are in wave 1, about 11% fell into that category for severe, very severe anxiety. This doubles then for My World Survey 2, about 22% falling into those categories. So yes, we did see that the proportion of adolescents who experienced severe, very severe anxiety and depression increased significantly from 2012 to 2019, and female and older adolescents had significantly higher levels of anxiety, depression, particularly for females. So looking then at the risk protective factors, what we saw here was that there was a significant increase in the risk factors from My World Survey 1 to 2. Avoidant coping showed a significant increase, parental mental health problems or addiction, cannabis use, with the exception of bullying. We saw a significant decrease in bullying, so rates went from 44% saying they'd been bullied to 34%. There was a significant reduction in alcohol risk behaviours and a significant reduction in parental criticism across the waves. Again, with the protective factors, we see significant decreases in the protective factors, so self-esteem, personal competence, optimism showed reductions, with the exception again here for social support, the availability of one good adult, peer connectedness, they showed significant increases. Again, as an example here, about 71% said that they had one good adult in My World Survey 1. This increased to 76% in My World Survey 2. And we saw no change then for certain protective factors such as parental approval and problem-focused coping. So the next step then to look at whether increases or decreases in the risk protective factors could potentially explain some of the changes in anxiety and depression. We ran a multi-group analysis where we regressed anxiety and depression on our 24 independent variables. And the first aim of the multi-group analysis was to test the stability of this model across waves, to see whether the regression coefficients showed a good fit, so whether we saw that these regression coefficients remained stable across waves. And when we did this here, you see model 1, we saw that the model did show a good fit to the data. So as a proxy here, the RMSEA was less than 0.05, 0.03. And then we looked at the modification indices to give us an indication where we could relax the parameter constraints for 9 pathways. And what this suggests is that the regression coefficient here for 9 pathways differ significantly from wave 1 to wave 2. As an example here, what we saw was that self-esteem to anxiety and self-esteem to depression from waves 1 to 2 differed significantly, suggesting that the regression coefficient for self-esteem to anxiety, for example, was significantly stronger at wave 2 than wave 1. Another finding here was alcohol regressed. The alcohol regression coefficient varies significantly to depression and anxiety across wave 1 and 2. So what we see here is that the predictors in terms of explaining anxiety, depression, explained a large portion of the variance. So we see that the R squared here is ranging from 37 to 60%. The effects were stronger for depression. And overall what we're seeing is that most regression coefficients are predictive across waves. So those highlighted in pink here, we're seeing that parental mental health problems, discrimination, bullying, avoidant coping, parental criticism, these are strong predictors of depression and anxiety across waves. And then when we look to see some negative predictors, these are the ones highlighted in orange. So peer connectedness, optimism, and having one good adult were linked with lower levels of depression and anxiety across waves. So then there were some unique findings, and so these are really the ones where the estimates varied across waves 1 and 2. And the main ones that are coming up here really are in anxiety. We're seeing that gender being female was a much stronger predictor of anxiety in wave 2 than wave 1. We're also seeing that those who engage in formal help seeking tendencies, it was a much stronger predictor of their anxiety at wave 1 than 2, and also self-esteem and the personal confidence were coming up as strong predictors, stronger predictor of anxiety depression at wave 2 than wave 1. Interestingly, for the depression, the main estimate that varied here was the self-esteem being a stronger predictor at wave 2 than wave 1. And interestingly, we see the alcohol, both for anxiety and depression, is a weaker predictor at wave 2 than wave 1, which does align with actually the international research showing that we know alcohol consumption is reducing in adolescents. It's still high, but it has reduced. And also that relationship to depression and anxiety is shown in other studies to show more reduced effect. So what this might suggest is that it's not causal relationships, we're very aware of that, but it suggests that these estimates that vary from wave 1 to wave 2 may be potential predictors in terms of explaining the increases in anxiety and depression at wave 2. And particularly what's coming up here is the predictors for anxiety, the personal confidence, and the self-esteem as being strong drivers of anxiety at wave 2. So just then to conclude, we do see that the prevalence of anxiety and depression, it was higher in 2019 than 2012. That would align with the international research. We do see a particularly elevation in females. We do see positive findings. Adolescents wave 2 did have higher levels of some protective factors. There was a higher percentage reporting they'd one good adult in their life. We also see lower levels of bullying and alcohol use, lower levels of parental criticism. The Health Behaviour of School-Age Children report in 2020 by Gavin et al. They reported improved communication with parents, a reduction in bullying and a reduction in alcohol use, and that's a national sample, but they're 10 to 18 years of age. And so while some factors were consistent predictors of anxiety and depression at both waves, bullying, discrimination, we do see that there were some unique factors predictive of the increases in anxiety and depression at wave 2. Being female, engaging in higher formal help-seeking tendencies, those who reported lower self-esteem and personal confidence. And we do know adolescents at a time where they're developing their self-concept, so there could be something here about a young person's self-concept, the facets of self-efficacy, self-esteem, personal confidence, feeding into explaining some of these increases in anxiety and depression. It could be that higher levels of anxiety and depression lead to reductions in self-esteem and personal confidence. And there's a need as well to look at how gender interacts with these risk protective factors in terms of explaining these outcomes. So yeah, I'll leave it there for today, and just to thank all the young people who took part in the research and also the funding received from Jigsaw and Electric Ireland. So thank you very much.